to the many thousands more who I haven't been able to read their tweets and their words of encouragement, as the senator from Kentucky, more than anyone, is standing with Rand.
Well, Mr. President, I'd like to thank the senator from Texas for coming to the floor and cheering me up. I was getting kind of tired, and I appreciate bringing news from the outside world. As you know, we're not allowed to have electronics on the floor, so I don't really have much knowledge of the electronic outside world, but actually it's probably a good thing for every American eventually not to see their phone or their computer for about 8 hours. So, but no, I think it, you know, the thing is that people think that we shouldn't, you know, people are always saying, don't fight and don't get along and stuff. I think people do want that, but they think that at the same time they want that and they want you to stand up for and stand for something and believe in something. And it doesn't have to mean that we do it in an acrimonious way. Even the senator from Illinois and I usually have civilized words together. There's a smile. And the thing about it is that there are principles that we ought to stand for. And I think the most important principle here, though, is that really this is a tug of war between the executive branch and the legislative branch. There may be some partisanship that we can't all get together in the Senate to say to the president that we think his power should be restrained. But I think at the same time there are some on the other side who are saying that. And really, that's what this should be about. It's about how much power can the president have. Can the president have the power to decide to kill Americans on American soil? But not only that, can the president have the power to decide when the Bill of Rights applies? You know, can you be targeted because you've been alleged to have committed some crime and your Bill of Rights is stripped away, even if you're here in the United States? I think it's a pretty easy question, and maybe someone from the media would ask the president tonight, I don't know if he's still up or not, but ask the president a question. Ask him, do you plan on killing Americans that are not in combat? Do you plan on killing Americans who are not in a combat position? People who you might be accusing of some kind of crime, but that aren't actually engaged in combat? I would think it'd be a simple answer. And in fact, I'm willing to go home if we can get an answer from the president that says people not engaged in combat won't be on any target list. I mean, it's a pretty simple question to ask and a pretty reasonable question to ask. And after much jockeying and debate with the senator from Texas asking the Attorney General this question, we finally did get to where it seems like he was coming towards, you know, not trying to, but being forced to say that it's not constitutional to kill non-combatants. I mean, it should be an easy question. And so we'll take a telegram, we'll even take a tweet. If the Attorney General would tweet us, we can have that relayed to the floor and let us know that basically they acknowledge that their power is not unlimited. And I don't think this is really an overstatement of the cause. This has been written up. Glenn Greenwald's written this up. Connor Friedersdorf has written this up, talking about the fact that if you have a war that has no end, if you have a war that has no geographic limit, and then if you have strikes that have no constitutional bounds, basically what you have is an unlimited imperial presidency. And this isn't a partisan issue. A lot of this began under George Bush, has been continued, expanded, doubled, and quintupled, and made 10 times worse by the current president. But even under George Bush, nobody ever maintained they could kill Americans at home. I can't imagine that the president, when he comes forward and says that he hasn't killed Americans yet and he doesn't intend to do it, but he might, that somehow we're supposed to be placated by that. Somehow that's supposed to be enough. And this isn't the first time we've seen this. First time we've seen a reversal in fortunes here, a reversal in what I think he stood for as a candidate. You know, I've said many times, probably 10 times today, I admired the president. I admired the president when he was a senator on many issues. I admired the president when he ran for office. But the president who ran for office and said, we're not going to tap phones without a warrant, The president who ran for office said we're not going to torture people, now says we're going to kill people with no due process. I find that incredibly hypocritical and incredibly ironic. And I see no reason why he can't come forward and say that that we don't get to pick and choose when the Fifth Amendment applies. We don't get to pick and choose when people can be accused of a crime and get no adjudication and be killed by a drone. So I just can't imagine that he can't answer these questions, and it's just not enough to say I don't intend to do so. Last year when we passed the National Defense Authorization Bill, there was included in that the ability to indefinitely detain an individual, an American citizen. In fact, I asked another senator on my side, I said, does that mean you can send an American to Guantanamo Bay? And he said, yes, if they're dangerous. Well, that would be fine if we all agree who's dangerous and who's committed a crime, but that would be an accusation. And that would have to be adjudicated somehow, and if you don't get a trial, how do you determine your innocence or guilt or whether you're being sent to Guantanamo Bay? The president, like so many times, said, oh, I don't support indefinite detention, and I would veto that. No, I won't veto that this time, but I would veto that if I were still candidate Barack Obama, but I'm President Barack Obama, I'm not going to veto that. And so instead he says, I have no intention of detaining anyone. Well, here's the problem. I mean, it's not good enough. The law is for everybody. It's not for saying, oh, I'm a good president. I went to Harvard. I'm not going to detain anybody. It's not enough. The law is what the law is. And if the law allows you to be detained as an American citizen, what about the next guy that's not so high-minded? The next guy that decides he's going to detain political opponents or ethnic groups or people that he has dislike for? What happens when that happens? It's not enough to say I don't intend to do something. And I would think the leader of the free world, the leader of, I think one of the most important nations, if not the most important nation or civilization we've had in historic times. That's what, I have high hopes and high estimations of who we are as a people. It's not enough to say I don't intend to break the Constitution. You either believe in the Constitution or you don't. I think illustrative of sort of this opinion was when I interviewed or asked questions to Senator Kerry when he was being nominated, and I asked him these questions about, can you go to war without a declaration of war? And his answer was, oh, of course I will support the Constitution, except for when I won't support the Constitution, when it's inconvenient. I mean, it's sometimes hard to go to war, and it's messy, and there's all this voting stuff, and people don't want to vote to go to war. They don't want to raise taxes. I mean, it's just hard to get the votes for war, and so when it's inconvenient, I won't. And that's the problem. And he asked me, or sort of insinuated, that I was an absolutist. Well, I don't know how to halfway believe that Congress should declare war. I don't know how to halfway believe in the Fifth Amendment. This isn't one that we're even debating exactly what it means, what the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment means. There's really not a lot of debate over what due process is when you're accused of a crime. When you're accused of something, you're indicted. When you're accused, you get a trial, you get due process. Nobody's really debating what that means. And yet, the Attorney General for this president has said that the Fifth Amendment will be applied when they can. Now, to be fair, I think he's referring to foreign strikes. He's talking about foreign strikes, and to tell you the truth, it is kind of muddled whether the Constitution applies to people in foreign lands or in foreign zones. But that's the whole point of this thing. The point is that this is America. We're not talking about a battlefield. And we're not talking about people using lethal force. If you're in America, if you're outside the Capitol and you've got a grenade launcher, you will be killed without due process. You don't get due process. You don't get an attorney. You don't get Miranda rights. Nobody thinks that you do. But if you're sitting in a cafe and somebody thinks you emailed your cousin in the Middle East and they think you're conspiring with them, you get it. You should be charged. You should be, imprisoned if they can make the charges stick. But they shouldn't just drop a hellfire missile on your cafe experience. we have to realize, and the president, above all people, someone who taught constitutional law, should realize that his opinion's not so important. Even as the president, it's not so important. For him to say that he doesn't intend to kill people, I would defy a constitutional lawyer in our country to say that that's important. I mean, the law is what it is, and he's going to give us a legal interpretation of the law and not what his intent is. To say he hasn't killed anybody yet, to say he has no intention of killing anybody, but he might, is just not really a legal standard that I choose to live by. It concerns me. It concerns me that we have documents in the United States that are produced by the government that indicate people who might be a terrorist. The Bureau of Justice came out with one last year, and it said people who are missing fingers, people who have colored stains on their clothes, people who have more than 7 days of food might be terrorists. Now, ironically, another government website says that if you live on the coast, you should have 7 days of food because there might be a hurricane. You might need to have that food. But another website says if you do, you might be crazy and a lunatic and a survivalist, and you might be somebody we might need to target with a drone. If you see somebody like this, you're supposed to report them. If you hear of people who have guns in their house or lots of weatherized ammunition or ready-to-eat meals, they could be on the target list. If that's who we are targeting to be terrorists, I certainly want a trial. I just wouldn't think that it would be enough to be accused. Now, people say, oh, well, this is just members of Al-Qaeda, but they don't have a membership card. I don't know that we've ever looked at anybody's because they're dead. They're blown up with a missile, so no one's looking at their Al-Qaeda membership card. But the thing is in the United States, saying someone is associated with Al-Qaeda or someone's associated with terrorism, we've had experience with government offices and officials talking about people who might be terrorists. The fusion centers in Missouri said that people who are pro-life might be terrorists. They said that people who are for secure borders might be terrorists. They said that people who vote for the Constitution Party or the Libertarian Party might be terrorists. So if you believe in signature strikes, I guess if you see the traffic going to the Libertarian Party convention, that you could probably just hit a caravan and get a whole bunch of them at once. Now people say, oh, that's absurd. The president's not advocating that. Well, he's advocating a drone strike program in America. All we have to compare it with is the drone strike program overseas. Now, he sort of said, when forced to, he doesn't want to talk about it, but when forced to, he says, well, the rules will probably be slightly different inside the U.S. than they will be outside the U.S., which begs the question that I guess he believes he does have the right to have a drone strike program in the U.S. He's just going to have slightly different rules. Well, I have an important question for him. He needs to give me a call. Is one of the rules of the inside the U.S. drone strike program going to be that you obey the Constitution? That you get a trial by a jury of your peers? Is that going to be in the rules inside of America as opposed to outside of America? It's disturbing that it's been so hard to get any information on this. I wouldn't have gotten any information at all, I don't think, had not we got some support from the other side. The senator from Oregon stood up in the committee. In fact, he asked the question before I did. I was fascinated when I saw him ask the question by the answer. Senator Wyden stood up in the Intelligence Committee and he said, can you do a drone strike on Americans on American soil? Here's John Brennan's response, I kid you not. Well, we need to optimize transparency, and we need to optimize secrecy. That was his answer. Well, here's the follow-up answer. What does that mean? Does that mean you can kill Americans on American soil? What are you trying to say, or what are you trying not to say? To Brennan's credit, finally he answered the question only when there was a threat of him not getting out of committee. And that was thanks to bipartisan support, Republicans and Democrats threatening to hold him up. He finally got out, but on the day we threatened to hold him up, or they threatened to hold him up, he finally responded. I'd sent him questions a month and a half previously, and I finally got an answer when there was a threat to his nomination coming out of committee. which isn't really the way it should work. Here's a guy, the president's bragging about how transparent the guy is, and he believes in transparent. He's such a high-minded fellow, but he won't give you any answers unless you force him to. Same with the president. So we finally get an answer, and John Brennan says, well, the CIA can't kill people in the United States. It's against the law. Well, yeah, we knew that. Thanks. Thanks for admitting you're going to obey the law. We really feel blessed that you've said you will now obey the law. But it's sad that it took a month and a half, and under severe duress, they've admitted they will obey the law and the CIA won't kill you in America. Problem is, it's kind of a tricky answer because they're not the ones running the drone program. The Defense Department is. So you can be assured the CIA is not going to kill you, but the Defense Department might. So still the answer is, we haven't killed anybody yet. We don't intend to, but we might. So that's what you're to be satisfied with. So we got the answer from the Attorney General, and his was a little more detailed and actually had some good things in it, but basically concluded by saying they could conceive of a place where you could get attacked or where the U.S. might attack Americans. But the examples they came up with were not really what we're asking about. So it's sort of like answering a question, but answering the question that wasn't asked. They said, well, if planes are flying at the Twin Towers and if Pearl Harbor's happening again, obviously, we could see a use for drone strikes. It's like, yeah, me too. I mean, if we're being attacked and there's a war, or even if there's a person with a grenade launcher, you have the ability to respond to that. No one's questioning that. The reason this question comes up is that a significant portion of the drone strikes overseas are occurring on people who are not involved in combat. Now, there's allegations that they're bad people and they may be in combat or may have been in combat, but they're not currently in combat. So the question is, are we going to use the foreign drone strike model in the United States? Are we going to kill non-combatants in the United States? Are we going to kill people who we suspect? Which sort of gets to the other question, when you talk about, what rules and procedures you expect in your country, do you expect that the police would come and arrest you and put you in jail for the rest of your life because they suspect something? Is suspicion enough? Well, obviously not. We believe that that's the beginning of it. Usually involves probable cause, involves a judge to get information. I have a message here not from the White House, a message saying the White House hasn't returned our phone calls. If anybody knows anybody at the White House and wants to call them, we are looking for an answer from the White House. We've called Justice also. I think the answer says something about the sequester. Maybe they're going to call me when the sequester is over. So I really think that one of the courtesies that they ought to think about is particularly if what they're hearing is something that they don't object to, why not end the debate by going ahead and letting us know? Why not go ahead and let us know that they agree that they're not going to be killing non-combatants? You'd think that'd be a pretty easy answer for them. But I think in negotiations with any kind of executive branch, this one or others, that when you get a non-answer or a non-responsive answer, or you get a refusal to answer, I think that's when you need to be concerned that the answer really is not the answer they want to be public. It's an answer that perhaps the Fifth Amendment will be optional depending on who's judging the circumstances. We look forward and look at some of the information that's been gathered over time on this. One of the interesting articles that we had collected on this was an article in the Los Angeles Times entitled, "Police Employ Predator Drone Spy Planes on the Home Front." This is an article by Brian Bennett. Reporting from Washington, Armed with a search warrant, Nelson County Sheriff Kelly Janke went looking for 6 missing cows on the Brossett farm in the early evening of June 23rd. 3 men brandishing rifles chased him off, he said. Janke knew the gunman could be anywhere on the 3,000-acre spread in eastern North Dakota. Fearful of an armed standoff, he called in reinforcements from the State Highway Patrol, a regional SWAT team, and a bomb squad, ambulances, and deputy sheriffs from 3 other counties. He also called in a Predator B drone. As the unmanned aircraft circled 2 miles overhead the next morning, sophisticated sensors under the nose helped pinpoint 3 suspects and showed they were unarmed. Police rushed in and made the first known arrest of U.S. citizens with help from a Predator drone, the spy drone that has helped revolutionize modern warfare. But that was just the start. Local police say they have used 2 unarmed Predators based at Grand Forks Air Force Base to fly at least 24 surveillance flights since June. The FBI and drug enforcement agents have used Predator drones for other domestic investigations. We don't use drones on every call-out, says Bill Mackey, head of the police SWAT team in Grand Forks. If we have something in town like an apartment complex, we don't call them. The drones belong to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, which operates 8 Predators on the country's northern and southwestern borders to search for illegal immigrants and smugglers. The previously unreported use of its drones to assist local, state, and federal law enforcement has occurred without any public acknowledgement or debate. Congress first authorized Customs and Border Protection to buy unarmed drones in 2005. Officials in charge of the fleet cite broad authority to work with police, from budget requests to Congress, that cite interior law enforcement support as part of their mission. In an interview, Michael C. Kostelnik, a retired Air Force general who heads the office that supervises the drones, said Predators are flown in many areas around the country, not only for federal operators, but also for state and local law enforcement and emergency responders in times of crisis. Former Representative Jane Harmon, who sat on the House Homeland Security Committee at the time and served as chairwoman from 2007 until this year, said no one ever discussed using Predators to help local police serve warrants or do other basic work. Using Predators for routine law enforcement without public debate or clear legal authority is a mistake, Harmon said. There's no question that this could become something that people will regret, said Harmon, who resigned from the House in February, now heads the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, a Washington think tank. The point is really that it isn't so much the technology. I'm not opposed to drones being used even domestically. It's really about the individual freedom. It's about the process. It's about how they're used. So for example, just like in national defense, if you're robbing a liquor store and it's safer to get you down with a drone, that's fine. If you're armed and robbing and threatening people in the liquor store and people as you come out with a weapon, I don't mind if you get shot with a drone or a rifle from a policeman. It is what it is. As one of my friends who's a physician said, when people would come in wounded from robbing someone, he liked to say, well, I guess that's an occupational hazard if you break into homes. But the thing is it really isn't the force that we're talking about. It's whether or not the process is right. So you can use lethal force when lethal force is threatened. The question about drones really is whether they're being used with warrants, you know, if you're spying on someone or doing surveillance on someone. And so one of the bills we introduced last year was a bill to require warrants for drone surveillance. This is a hot topic, and I think will probably eventually get up to the Supreme Court. I don't believe it has yet. There were cases that were talking about GPS tagging of cars, and the Supreme Court ruled that you can't do that without a warrant. My suspicion is they'll rule in favor of warrants on drones too, although there's some dispute over what they call open spaces. And I think that with open spaces, we need to be concerned that just because you're not inside your house doesn't mean that you don't still deserve some privacy on your own land. So it's not so much that the drone is necessarily our enemy, but it just allows government to do so much more that we need to be very careful about the safeguards of the Constitution, and requiring whether or not these safeguards are met as far as protecting our liberty. In 2008 and 2010, this is with the same article from the LA Times, Harmon helped beat back efforts by Homeland Security officials to use imagery from military satellites to help domestic investigations. Congress blocked the proposal on grounds it would violate the Posse Comitatus Act. Now, the Posse Comitatus Act is pretty important, and it's been part of our discussion today, and we're not the first person to raise this. The military is not authorized to operate in the United States. And you say, well, why not? Well, the reason is they operate under different rules of engagement than your police do. In Afghanistan or Iraq or in any kind of war theater, you don't have warrants, you don't have Miranda rights, you don't get due process in war. But at home, you do. That's why it's important that we get folks to acknowledge that this is not a battlefield. America's not a battlefield. It's a place where you have constitutional rights and have for hundreds of years. But the Posse Comitatus Act after the Civil War regulated and prohibited the military from acting as a police or taking a police role on U.S. soil. Proponents say that the high-resolution cameras, heat sensors, and sophisticated radar on the border protection drones, and this is the other point, these drones were legislated to be used on the border, and you can argue that there's a federal role for monitoring our borders for national defense and other reasons. But now they're loaning them out to local law enforcement, and law enforcement's also buying drones directly. So they have high-resolution cameras, heat sensors, and sophisticated radar on the border protection drones that can help track criminal activity in the United States, just as the CIA uses Predators and other drones to spy on militants in Pakistan, nuclear sites in Iran, and other targets around the globe. For decades, U.S. courts have allowed law enforcement to conduct aerial surveillance without a warrant. This is that sort of open spaces doctrine. I'm not saying it makes it right, but the government's been doing it for decades. Some of the courts apparently have ruled that what a person does in the open, even behind a backyard fence, can be seen from a passing airplane and is not protected by privacy laws. Well, you know, I don't think I agree with that. I mean, if you're swimming in your pool in your backyard or you're in your hot tub in your backyard, just because we have the technology to be able to see you in your hot tub, does that really mean they've got a right to look at what you're doing in your backyard? So I don't really accept that. And I think it's been abused and something that really we should be fighting against, you know, this surveillance state. Advocates say Predators are simply more effective than other planes. Flying out of earshot and out of sight, a Predator B can watch a target for 20 hours nonstop, far longer than any police helicopter or manned aircraft. What I would say there is it seems like that might be somewhat analogous to the GPS case, because the Supreme Court ruled that you can't just tag people's car and just watch them constantly waiting to see if they break any laws. And so I would think the same for a Predator, that you just stake them out, watch, and eventually you'll get somebody breaking the speed limit or running a stop sign. I don't think that's what was really intended. Howard Safir says, I am for the use of drones. He's the former head of operations of the U.S. Marshal Service and former New York City Police Commissioner. He said drones could help police in manhunts, hostage situations, and other difficult cases. I agree completely. If someone's being held in harm's way, if someone's being held and threatened, absolutely, drones are a great idea. So it's not that I'm opposed to the technology. I am not particularly excited about them hovering outside your window, looking over your shoulder at what magazines you read, whether you're reading any free market magazines that might be offensive to government officials. So I think that we don't want people looking into your activities in your house without a warrant. But I think in situations where people have already broken the law and there's lethal force being exposed and there are people that are in danger, why wouldn't we want to use a drone versus a policeman to save the life of a policeman going into a difficult situation? So I think those probably will come to fruition, and that doesn't really bother me. And in some ways, it's a little bit analogous to the situation we're talking about with drone strikes by the military in the United States. It's not so much that anybody's really opposed to using a drone to shoot down a plane that's flying in to attack us, or people are flying into a building to knock a building down, or flying into the Capitol. Nobody's really opposed to using a drone when there's a lethal imminent force. The problem is it's gotten so convoluted because, the president said imminent threat doesn't have to be immediate. And so that's the kind of thing we're concerned about. We're not concerned really about, a threat, an imminent or lethal threat where someone responds. What we're concerned about is a drone strike against a non-combatant. Seems like it ought to be an easy question for the president. Couldn't he at least just respond and say, you know what, I've always believed this, I just forgot to mention it, and we weren't very clear in the way we expressed it, but obviously we would never use a drone against a non-combatant. He needs to say that, though, because the drones overseas are being used against non-combatants, and we need to know what the rules are going to be. This is a long, drawn-out day, but it's to try to get some answers. It's to try to shame the president into doing the right thing. I think he knows what the right thing is. I think the president, part of him would like to do the right thing. But I think there's a certain stubbornness there, too. I think there's a certain belief that he's the president, and presidents have all this power, and he doesn't want to give any of that power up. And I think some of that you see, with Republicans and Democrats, frankly, that people leave the legislative branch. When they get into the White House, they think, I'm a good person. I would never use the power wrongly, so why would it be wrong if I got more power? Why would it be wrong if I said, I'm going to use the Fifth Amendment, people will get due process, except for sometimes when I just think they're really bad people. And then I won't use the Fifth Amendment. We won't get due process. Now, privacy advocates say that drones help police snoop on citizens in ways that push current law to the breaking point. Anytime you have a tool like that in your hands of law enforcement, it makes it easier to do surveillance. They'll do more of it, says Ryan Kalo, Director of Privacy and Robotics at the Standard Law School's Center for Internet and Society. This could be a time when people are uncomfortable and they want to place limits on that technology. It could make us question the doctrines that you do not have privacy in public. I think that's a good point. Maybe we will question some of the things we've said before about open spaces now that we can crisscross every minute inch of your open spaces. You have to imagine that we now have drones that weigh less than an ounce. So we're not even talking about the pictures of you coming down. And some of us, after a while, really don't want pictures of us in our bathing suit, whether it's 2 miles up or whether it's, from 5 feet in front of us. And so I can't imagine that we would eventually rule that a drone could swoop down and be 10 feet over your fence. But what's the question going to be? Can they be 10 feet over your fence or 2,000 feet in the air and still snoop on you without any kind of probable cause? Do we want to live in a police state is basically what the question is. Do you want to live in a surveillance state? But it's going to take people who stand up and say enough's enough, that we're just not going to do this, instead of everybody being like a herd of lemmings and just going off the cliff saying, lead me, take care of me. We have to ask the question, that Franklin asked. Are you going to trade your liberty for security? Are you so fearful? Are you so afraid that you're willing to trade your liberty for security? And that's sort of the underlying question to this entire debate. In the Los Angeles Times article, they continue, this could be a time when people are uncomfortable and they want to place limits on that technology. It could make us question the doctrine that you do not have privacy in public. This is from a June 13th article, 2012, in Wired magazine by Lorenzo Franceschi Bicchieri. We like to think of the drone war as something far away, fought in the deserts of Yemen or the mountains of Afghanistan. But we now know it's closer than we thought. There are 64 drone bases on American soil. That includes 12 locations housing Predator and Reaper unmanned aerial vehicles, which can be armed. Public Intelligence, a nonprofit that advocates for free access to information, released a map, which probably is not a very good idea, to tell you the truth, the map of where our drone bases are in the United States, assembled from military sources, especially little known since June 2011. The possibility of military drones, as well as those controlled by police departments and universities flying over American skies, have raised concerns among privacy activists. The other thing that should concern everybody, and probably people saw this, is they had some university students seeing if they could commandeer a drone. So they had a drone fly over, and a guy that didn't know the frequency, all of a sudden within 2 minutes is commandeering the drone. And there's questions whether that's what happened in Iran or whether the thing landed accidentally. I don't really know the answer to that. But I think it's of concern that the drones could be commandeered and used by other people. It's also of concern that ultimately our enemies are going to have these drones too. And so while war is a messy thing and there are a lot of imperfections to war, I think the way we act in war should be the way we ultimately want to be treated in war. And you know, it's easier said than done, and I don't think an easy doctrine, but it's something that we should aspire to. The possibility of military drones, as well as those controlled by police departments and universities flying over American skies, has raised concerns among privacy activists. The American Civil Liberties Union explained in its December report that the machines potentially could be used to spy on American citizens. The drone's presence in our skies threatened to eradicate existing practical limits on aerial monitoring. I wouldn't mind having some more articles that are more for civil liberties, less. The drone's presence in our skies threatens to eradicate existing practical limits on aerial monitoring and allowing for pervasive surveillance, police fishing expeditions, and abusive use of these tools in a way that would eventually eliminate the privacy Americans have traditionally enjoyed in their movements and activities. I've told people that when I first read 1984, you know, I was bothered by it, and everybody's bothered by, you know, Big Brother being able to have these two-way televisions in your house and they see everything you do and you can't escape Big Brother. But part of the consolation I had and part of the feeling I had was, well, they can't do this. The technology doesn't exist. When I was a kid, it didn't exist. It's amazing, though, to think that Orwell writes this in 1949, before any of this technology was. We were getting closer in the 70s when I was a kid, and now we're there, though. The technology is there. So while technology is not an enemy, and technology is not something we can or should ban, technology makes your privacy more important. It makes the defense of your privacy something that needs to be guarded more jealously, because your government now does have the technology to see your every movement, to monitor your every move. So do your enemies, for that matter. So you can imagine you don't want the police GPS tagging you. You probably don't want your political opponents tagging your car either. So there have to be some protections of privacy. The issue and discussion of privacy has been one that conservatives and people on the right haven't always been as unified. Now, libertarians on the right have been better with these issues, and some conservatives have as well. But the question has always been, do you have a right to privacy? I've always said, sure, you have a right to privacy. I can't imagine why you wouldn't have a right to privacy. Now, some on the conservative side say, well, you don't really have a right to privacy. It's not, nobody talked about it in the Constitution, so you don't necessarily have a right to privacy. I kind of disagree, because I think what's talked about in the Constitution are the freedoms you gave up or you agreed to have limited. The freedoms that you didn't agree to have limited are unnamed. They're unenumerated, and the 9th and 10th Amendment says they're to be left to the states and people. The things in the 9th and 10th Amendment, what it says is that there's a plethora of rights. There's an unlimited amount of rights, and they're yours. They're to stay with you unless the government explicitly takes these rights away from you. And so what the conclusion I have with the right to privacy is that I think you do have a right to privacy. And I think you have a right to private property. Now, private property isn't listed in the Constitution either, but I think all of our founding fathers believed in private property, and some of them talked about actually putting the word in there, but I think some of them liked more the idea, instead of life, liberty, and property, they liked life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And I think it has a more noble ring to it because it's not talking about the property to lead, but pursuit of happiness does involve the pursuit of gaining of things that you will own. One of the things about our government and about the rule of law, and one of the things really that frankly I think a lot of people don't think about, but that makes us an incredibly prosperous nation, is the certainty of the law. And by that what I mean is that the certainty of ownership. And this gets to sort of the idea of why not only do we want these rights for the civil protection, so we can't be incarcerated or accused of a crime falsely without being able to defend ourselves, we also want the rule of law to be consistent for everyone and not mutable. We don't want it to be arbitrary. We don't want the whims of any politician or any executive to be able to decide what the law is. And this isn't the first time that I've had some disagreement with the president on this. When we had some of the bankruptcies, when the car companies were going bankrupt, I believe it was with the Chrysler bankruptcy, that as things went through, there were people who were creditors and they owned part of the company. I learned this firsthand because I actually had some Fruit of the Loom stock. When Fruit of the Loom went bankrupt, I thought, well, I'll get something, right? They'll be bought out, and I'll get some money when they're bought out. I didn't get anything. I was an unsecured creditor. Well, apparently in the Chrysler thing, so were the labor unions, and usually what happens is a company unfortunately goes bankrupt, all those contracts would be renegotiated, and really then the car companies could become competitive. They could become like Toyota or other successful companies that are non-unionized, and they might have become successful again. But instead, we took the actual bankruptcy law and we turned it on its head. When we do this, and when we bail out banks and things and change the rules in midpoint, it changes what investors do. And it changes that certainty that investors need, either in banks or in car companies. Pension plans invest in a lot of these things. And so a lot of people think, oh, well, the president, had preference for the union because he liked the union. Well, that's fine, but teachers are in a union too, and they had a pension plan, and they owned Chrysler stock, and they got ripped off because he changed the law and gave the money to the auto workers union, but he took it from somebody else. The problem is you need those pension funds, some of which are regular working folks. Firemen have them, police have them, teachers have them. It's one of the things that wasn't fully explained, I think, in the Romney election. He got so much grief for running these funds, but a lot of the people who became successful along with him and who made money were just average, ordinary citizens that are teachers, firemen, and policemen. Their pension plan is there was there in Bain Capital. And I think that was never fully explained. But my point is, with the rule of law, is that certainty is what creates our wealth in our country. One of the reasons it's hard for Africa to get ahead, Africa has great resources, diamonds and minerals. One of the big reasons they don't get ahead is because there's corruption in their government. Some of that corruption we aid and abet because we give foreign aid directly to corrupt governments who steal it. Mubarak was one of the richest men in the world, probably worth between 5 and 10 billion, maybe 15, 20 billion. We gave him 60 billion, so I guess we should be thankful he only stole, a third of it. Mobutu in Central Africa stole billions. There was no running water, no electricity. He and the soldiers around him lived high off the hog, and they took our money and stole it as well. But the problem is not only do you have the kleptocracy and the stealing of foreign aid, but then you don't have the certainty of your property. A lot of capital formation in our country is based on your home loans. It used to be before the housing market went south, but it still is. It's where a lot of capital comes from, particularly for average ordinary citizens, is borrowing against their house. If you don't have that certainty of the law, it's a problem. So what we're talking about today is more certainty of your liberty from unfair prosecution or unfair arrest or unfair death ultimately from a drone, which takes consistency of law, which takes that the Constitution will be adhered to, and it will be adhered to consistently and not in an arbitrary fashion. So it's important not only for your civil liberties, it's also important for your private property as well to have a rule of law. People talk about a rule of law, and they talk about it all the time, but I don't think it fully gets through to everybody exactly what a rule of law means and how important it is. Hayek wrote that nothing more clearly distinguishes an arbitrary society from the rule of law, or arbitrary society from a stable society, than the rule of law. He said that the rule of law is what gives that certainty to the marketplace. So it's not enough just to have freedom. You can have complete and random anarchic freedom, and you may well not get prosperity if you don't have a law that stabilizes things. You have to have a police force and a judiciary that enforces contracts. So that's a lot of what goes on in the developing worlds that they don't have. They've got kleptocracy, which we aid and abet by giving them money and giving it to thieves because the thieves are our friends, not somebody else's friends. But then they also have this instability by not having a rule of law. The presence of drones in our skies, threatens to eradicate existing practical limits on monitoring. This comes from the article in Wired by Lorenzo Franceschi Bicchieri. As Danger Room reported last month, even military drones, which are prohibited from spying on Americans, may accidentally conduct surveillance and keep the data for months afterwards while they figure out what to do with it. The material they collect without a warrant, as scholar Stephen Aftergood revealed, could then be used to open an investigation. The Posse Comitatus Act prohibits the U.S. military from operating on American soil. So once again, if we go back to asking the president this question, can you do military strikes on Americans on American soil? An easy answer is I will obey the law. The law says he can't do it. And yet he indicates that he's going to have different rules inside America than outside America for his drone strikes, which implies that he thinks he can do it. The Posse Comitatus Act expressly forbids the military from operating in the United States. So if he's going to kill Americans in America, it will either be in defiance of the Posse Comitatus Act, or he's going to have to arm the FBI with drones to kill people. The problem is, I think once he gets into the FBI, the ludicrous nature of what he's asserting will really be, I think, paramount. I can't imagine that he can argue at that point that we're not going to obey the Bill of Rights with the FBI because we already do with the FBI. So many of the answers are pretty simple here and pretty easy, and I just can't imagine why he's resisting doing this. There's a new map that comes out almost 2 months after the Electronic Frontier Foundation revealed another one, this time of public agencies, including police departments and universities that have a permit issued by the Federal Aviation Agency to use drones in American airspace. It goes to show you how entrenched drones already are, said Trevor Tim, an EFF activist, when asked about the new map. It's clear that the drone industry is expanding rapidly, and this map is just another example of that. And if people are worried about military technology coming back and being sold in the U.S., this is just another example of how drone technology is probably going to proliferate in the U.S. very soon. This is another article from February of 2013. This is in Wired. It's called "Domestic Drone Industry Prepares for Big Battle with Regulators." For a day, a sandy-haired Virginian named Jeremy Novara was the hero of the nascent domestic drone industry. Novara went to the microphone at a ballroom in a Ritz-Carlton outside D.C. and did something many in his business want to do: tenaciously challenged the drone regulators at the FAA to loosen restrictions on unmanned planes over the United States. Judging from the reaction he received and from the stated intentions of the drone advocates who convened the forum, the domestic drone industry expects to do a lot more of that in the next coming months. There's been a lot of hype around unmanned drones becoming a fixture over U.S. airspace. You may have seen just 2 days ago, I think a pilot coming into New York City saw one on the way down, and I saw the report, I think yesterday, saying they're still asking whose drone it was. You would think certainly we'd have found out in 24 hours. I would think for certain it would probably be a government drone, but it's a little worrisome that they're seeing drones that they don't know who's flying them or where they are as far as getting in the way of our commercial airliners. There's been a lot of hype about drones becoming fixtures over U.S. airspace, both for law enforcement use and for operations by businesses as varied as farmers and filmmakers. This sort of leads to another point, that it's not the technology that we're opposed to. There's going to be all kinds of private uses for drones. There have to be some rules where they're flown so they don't get in the way of airplanes. But I would think farmers and ranchers might want to use drones to look at their, I don't know, count their cattle or their sheep. I don't know if you do that or not. But I mean, there's going to be private uses for these drones that won't be objectionable. All of these have big implications, though, for traditional conceptions of privacy, as unmanned planes can loiter over people's backyards and snap pictures for far longer than piloted aircraft. The government is anticipating that drone makers would generate a windfall of cash as drones move from the military to the civilian role. Jim Williams of the Federal Aviation Administration told a conclave at the Drone Manufacturers Conference that the potential market for government and commercial drones could generate nearly $90 billion in economic activity. But there is an obstacle, they say, the FAA. The FAA has been reluctant to grant licenses out of fear that the drones, which maneuver poorly, have an alarming crash rate, and are spoofable, don't have the sensing capacity to spot approaching aircraft, which could complicate and endanger U.S. airspace. The FAA has been criticized some by, there's a group called the Electronic Frontier Foundation for not being transparent about its licenses. And they've filed Freedom of Information Act because they'd like to know whether the intentions of those putting the drones up is benign or whether it involves some kind of surveillance. I think ultimately, we talk a lot about the government spying on us, but I think there's great potential for your competitors, your enemies, and other people to spy on you with drones, particularly as they become cheaper. Those issues will be complicated. I think one way to sort of rectify or give an answer to those is I think your property from where it starts on the ground up is yours. People can fly over it, but I don't think they should be able to snoop and look down in it. I think probably private or public looking down on your property. That'll be something, though, that the courts will continue to have to work out. There was a push last year by Congress and the Obama administration directing the FAA to fully integrate unmanned aircraft into American skies. It hasn't been nearly enough for the drone makers. The FAA is months late in designating 6 test sites for drones around the country. What you can do is try to find me good articles. The question's, when the test site selection will begin. I'm sure that all of you are asking that now, says Williams, the head of the FAA's drone division. Drone makers are also frustrated by the logic of existing regulations. Currently, a drone weighing under 55 pounds, flying 400 feet within an operator's line of sight and away from an airport is considered a model airplane and cleared to fly without a license. That is, if it's not engaging in any for-profit activity. Sort of. A farmer can be a modeler if they operate their aircraft as a hobby or for recreational purposes. Enter Novara, a 31-year-old who owns a small drone business in Falls Church, Virginia, called Vanilla Aircraft. If a farmer who hopefully is profit-minded can fly as a hobbyist an unmanned aircraft, Novara challenged Williams, why can't I, as the owner of an unmanned aircraft company, fly as a hobbyist my own unmanned aircraft over property that I own? The guidelines for this were that any commercial intent is prohibited, but the bottom line is there's going to be a lot of things that we're going to enter into with private drones, but opposition to the technology, either for military purposes or for private purposes, is not something that we are going after. What we're talking about is whether or not your privacy will be respected and whether your constitutional rights will be protected. This is a new article from today by Connor Friedersdorf. It's called Killing Americans on U.S. Soil, Eric Holder's Evasive, Manipulative Letter. On December 7, 1941, Japanese warplanes bombed the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 6 decades later, al-Qaeda terrorists flew hijacked airplanes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Neither President Roosevelt nor President Bush targeted and killed Americans on U.S. soil in the aftermath of these attacks. Doing so wouldn't have made any sense. How strange, then, that Attorney General Eric Holder invoked these very attacks in a letter confirming that President Obama believes there are circumstances in which he could order Americans targeted and killed on U.S. soil. Kind of strange. The things that he gives as justification are things in which we didn't kill Americans. It's possible, I suppose, to imagine, these are Eric Holder's words now, it's possible, I suppose, to imagine an extraordinary circumstance in which it would be necessary and appropriate under the Constitution and applicable laws for the President to authorize the military to use lethal force within the territory of the United States, he wrote. For example, the President could conceivably have no choice but to authorize the military to use force, if necessary, to protect the homeland in the circumstances of a catastrophic attack like what happened in 1941 and again on 9/11. This very scenario to be guarded against is a president using the pretext of a terrorist attack to seize extraordinary powers. Isn't that among the most likely scenarios for the United States turning into an authoritarian security state? To be sure, if Americans are at the controls of fighter jets en route to Hawaii, of course Obama could order that they be fired upon. If Americans hijacked a plane, of course it would be permissible to kill them before they could crash it into a building. But those are not the sort of targeted killings we're talking about. What we're talking about is killing people not engaged in combat because you suspect them of being a terrorist. If you read to the end of Holder's letter, to the passage where he said, and this is Friedersdorf again, if you read to the end of Holder's letter, to the passage where he says, were such an emergency to arise, I would examine the particular facts and circumstances before advising the President on the scope of his authority. It becomes clear that despite invoking Pearl Harbor and 9/11, even he isn't envisioning a response to an attack in process, which would have to happen immediately. So what does he envision? If he can see that, for example, is necessary to explain, he ought to give us a clarifying example rather than a nonsensical one that seems to name-check events for their emotional resonance more than for their aptness to the issue. Elsewhere in his letter, Holder writes that the U.S. government has not carried out drone strikes in the United States and has no intention of doing so. As a policy matter, moreover, we reject the use of military force where well-established law enforcement authorities in the country provide the best means for incapacitating a terrorist threat. Interesting, they reject it as a policy matter, but aren't willing to reject military force in the United States as a legal matter. This is a good distinction, even in instances where law enforcement would better incapacitate the threat. For the Obama administration, conceding that the executive branch is legally forbidden to do certain things is verboten. So it is kind of interesting. They're willing, when they are willing to admit to any kind of limitations on their power, they say policy-wise they might be limited, but they're not willing to say legally they are limited. And this is a problem of not just this administration, but the previous one, of thinking that any kind of inch that they give to another branch of government, that they will be losing some of their power, and they're unwilling to do it.